Consider, for a moment, the paradox of the human face. When you look around a busy airport terminal or a crowded city street, you see a dazzling array of variety, different skin tones, eye shapes, hair textures, and heights. It feels as though humanity is an endlessly diverse tapestry. But this is an illusion. If you were to look under the hood, deep into our genetic code, you would find a shocking mystery that has puzzled biologists for decades. We are, essentially, clones. A single troop of chimpanzees living in one small patch of forest in West Africa holds more genetic variation between them than all 8 billion humans alive today combined. This genetic uniformity is the smoking gun of a terrifying crime scene from our distant past. It tells us that at some point, not so long ago in the grand scheme of geological time, we almost didn't make it. The human story is not one of inevitable triumph. It is a story of a fragile thread that came within a breath of snapping. Tonight, we are going to trace that thread. We are going to follow the most epic journey ever undertaken, a 60,000-year odyssey that began with a small band of survivors on the African continent and ended with the conquest of every habitable corner of the globe. From the heat of the rift valleys to the frozen steppes of the north, across invisible bridges of land and vast, terrifying oceans, we will walk in the footsteps of ancestors who had no maps, no written word, and no destination, yet somehow managed to find the whole world. To understand how we left Africa, we must first understand why there were so few of us to begin with. The clock turns back to approximately 74,000 years ago. At this time, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, had already existed for perhaps 200,000 years. We were established, but we were not dominant. We shared the planet with other hominids, the stocky Neanderthals in Europe, the elusive Denisovans in Asia, and perhaps other stranger cousins lingering on isolated islands. But then, the Earth itself seemed to turn against us. On the island of Sumatra, in present-day Indonesia, a supervolcano known as Mount Toba erupted. This was not a standard volcanic event. It was a cataclysm of apocalyptic proportions. Toba ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that into perspective, it was thousands of times more powerful than the eruption of Mount St. Helens. The explosion was so violent that it likely vaporized the mountain itself, leaving behind the massive caldera lake we see today. But the immediate blast was only the beginning. The ash plume rose high into the stratosphere, spreading like a suffocating blanket across the globe, blocking out the sun. The result was a volcanic winter. Temperatures plummeted globally. For years, perhaps a decade, the sky was a bruised purple gray, and the sun was nothing more than a pale, heatless disk. Plants died off in mass die-offs, the herds of grazing animals starved, and the food chain collapsed. For early humans living in Africa, this was the moment of the great bottleneck. Genetic studies suggest that the human population crashed continuously, perhaps dwindling to as few as 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs. Imagine that. The entire future of our species, every symphony ever written, every city ever built, every child born, was contained within a population the size of a small town. These survivors were likely clinging to the coastlines, specifically the southern tip of Africa, in places like Pinnacle Point. Here, the ocean provided a buffer against the climatic chaos, while the interior of the continent turned into an arid, uninhabitable dust bowl under the darkened skies. The caves at Pinnacle Point offered shelter, and the sea offered salvation. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a shift in behavior, born of desperate necessity. The survivors weren't just scavenging, they were adapting. They began to harvest shellfish from the intertidal zones, a nutrient-dense food source rich in the omega-3 fatty acids essential for brain development. It is in these caves, during the long, dark millennia of the bottleneck, that the modern human mind truly began to sharpen. We see the first evidence of complex heat treatment of stone. They weren't just chipping rocks, they were cooking a specific type of stone called silcrete to make it easier to flake into precise, lethal points. This required planning, patience, and a deep understanding of materials. We also see the first glimmers of symbolic thought, Pieces of ochre, a soft red stone, were ground down, perhaps to paint bodies or cave walls. Tiny snail shells were perforated to be worn as beads. These people, huddling together against the cold and the dark, were signaling to one another, "I am me, and you are you." They were building a social identity, a crucial glue that would hold their bands together during the trials to come. As the millennia passed, the volcanic winter eventually subsided. The ash settled, the sun returned, and the planet began to warm, though it remained in the grip of the chaotic climate fluctuations of the Ice Age. The population began to recover, slowly expanding from that tiny kernel of survivors. But the memory of the near extinction remained written in our DNA. We are all descendants of those few hardy beachcombers who outlasted the Toba catastrophe. By about 60,000 years ago, the stage was set for the next act. The climate in Africa began to shift again, but this time in a way that beckoned rather than threatened. The interior of the continent, which had been dry and forbidding, began to green. The orbital mechanics of the Earth, the slight wobble in its axis, altered the path of the monsoon rains. This phenomenon, often called the Green Sahara or Green Arabia effect, turned desert barriers into lush corridors of grassland and lakes. The herds of gazelle, antelope, and wildebeest began to move north and east, following the fresh grass, and naturally, the hunters followed. This was not a conscious migration in the way we think of it today. There was no tribal council pointing a spear toward the horizon and declaring a march to a new land. It was a slow generational drift. A band of hunter-gatherers might move 5 miles a year, following the game, seeking cleaner water, or simply putting distance between themselves and a rival group. But 5 miles a year, over 1,000 years, is a journey of 5,000 miles. They moved up through the Great Rift Valley, the cradle of our species, moving toward the Horn of Africa. The world they walked through was teeming with megafauna, giant beasts that would be unrecognizable to us today, alongside the familiar ancestors of modern elephants and lions. They carried with them their toolkit of microliths, small, sharp stone blades, and their mastery of fire. But most importantly, they carried a cognitive flexibility that no other animal possessed. They could look at a landscape and understand how to exploit it, how to communicate complex plans to one another, and how to adapt their technology to new challenges. They stood at the edge of the Red Sea, which looked very different than it does today. Sea levels were significantly lower because much of the world's water was locked up in the massive ice sheets covering the northern hemisphere. The gap between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, or the Gate of Tears, was narrow, perhaps dotted with islands that are now submerged. On the other side lay a world entirely new, a gateway to the rest of the planet. The decision to cross, or perhaps the accidental drifting across on rafts or by wading through shallow shoals, marked the point of no return. They were leaving the biological cradle that had nurtured hominids for millions of years. They were stepping into the unknown. Behind them lay the familiarity of the savanna and the safety of the known world. Ahead lay the vast open canvas of Eurasia, a continent filled with strange climates, unfamiliar predators, and other species of humans who had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. The genetic bottleneck had forged a resilient, sharp-witted survivor population. The recovery had built their numbers back up to a point where expansion was possible. And now, the Green Gate was open. The great engine of human migration was idling, ready to roar into life. The first footsteps were about to be taken on a road that would eventually lead to the conquest of the entire planet. But as they stood on those African shores, looking across the shimmering water, they could not possibly have known that they were the vanguard of a species that would one day touch the moon. They were simply looking for a better place to camp, a new herd to hunt, and a safe place to sleep as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ancient sky in hues of violet and gold. The crossing of the Bab el-Mandeb was likely not a single dramatic event, but a stuttering, tentative process that took place over centuries. The name itself, Bab el-Mandeb, translates from Arabic as the Gate of Tears, a reference to the treacherous navigation and the many who have drowned there in historical times. But 60,000 years ago, The geology was on the side of our ancestors. With so much global water locked away in the great northern ice sheets, the sea level was roughly 70 meters lower than it is today. The strait, which is currently about 20 miles wide, would have been significantly narrower, perhaps reduced to a mere 7 or 8 miles of open water, broken up by a chain of rocky islands that beckoned like stepping stones. We can imagine the scene. Small bands of families standing on the arid cliffs of what is now Djibouti or Eritrea, looking across the channel. They would have seen the faint, hazy outline of land on the other side. They were not boat builders in the modern sense. They had no keels, no sails, and no navigational stars to guide them. But they were observers. They would have watched the debris drifting on the currents, tree trunks, mats of tangled vegetation, and realized that flotation was possible. Maybe they lashed together reeds or logs to form crude rafts, or maybe they simply swam the gaps between the islands during low tide, clutching their precious fire-starting kits and skins of fresh water above the waves. When they finally dragged themselves onto the opposite shore, stepping onto the soil of what is now Yemen, they did not find an alien world. In fact, to their eyes, it would have looked reassuringly familiar. They had not landed in the barren, scorched sand dunes we associate with the Arabian Peninsula today. They had arrived during a humid climatic window, a period when the intertropical convergence zone, the band of rain that girdles the earth, had shifted northwards. The monsoon rains that today soak India and Southeast Asia were then drenching Arabia. This was the era of the Green Arabia. Satellite imagery today reveals the ghostly outlines of vast ancient river networks buried beneath the sands of the empty quarter. Paleolakes, some the size of small seas, dotted the landscape. If you were to walk through the Rub al-Khali Desert 60,000 years ago, you wouldn't be fighting thirst. You would be pushing through tall grasses reaching your waist, skirting the edges of swamps teeming with life. Fossil records from the region paint a vibrant picture. Hippopotamuses wallowed in the mud of Saudi Arabia, water buffalo grazed on the riverbanks, and gazelles moved in massive herds across the plains. For the new arrivals, this was a paradise. It was an extension of the African savanna they had left behind, a home away from home. They didn't need to reinvent their survival strategies immediately. The hunting techniques that worked in the Rift Valley worked perfectly here. They could track the same types of game, gather similar plants, and find shelter in the limestone caves that honeycombed the hills. Archaeological sites like Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates have yielded stone tools from this precise period, hand axes and scrapers buried deep beneath the sand that are stylistically identical to those found in East Africa. It is the technological fingerprint of a successful crossover. This pause in Arabia is a crucial, often overlooked chapter in the human story. We tend to think of migration as a continuous movement, a long march, but it was actually a series of pulses and pauses. The humans who crossed the Red Sea likely stalled in this lush Arabian nursery for thousands of years. They weren't rushing to get to China or Europe. They had no concept that such places existed. They were simply living, expanding their numbers in a resource-rich environment. This population growth was vital. It turned the fragile band of survivors from the African bottleneck into a robust, sustainable population capable of handling the trials ahead. However, the Earth is a restless host. The climatic pendulum began to swing back. The wobble of the planet's axis continued its slow cycle, and the monsoons began to retreat southwards. The rains that had fed the Great Lakes of Arabia faltered. Slowly, imperceptibly, the grasslands began to yellow and die. The waterholes shrank into muddy puddles, and the game herds began to thin out or migrate. The green Arabia was drying up, turning back into the desert barrier we know today. This climatic squeeze applied a new pressure on the human population. They could not stay put. To retreat back across the Red Sea was likely impossible or culturally unthinkable. The currents might have changed, or the memory of the old home had faded into myth. They had to move. The drying interior forced them toward the edges of the peninsula, pushing them to the periphery where water was still guaranteed. This necessity drove them toward the Persian Gulf. Today, the Gulf is a sea, an arm of the Indian Ocean separating Arabia from Iran. But during the Ice Age, with sea levels so low, The Persian Gulf was a dry basin. It was a massive fertile oasis fed by the combined flow of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun rivers, which wound their way through the valley before emptying into the ocean near the Strait of Hormuz. This Gulf oasis would have been a sanctuary as the rest of Arabia desiccated. It was likely one of the most densely populated places on the planet for early humans, a rich estuary environment full of birds, fish, and edible plants. It was here, at this geographic crossroads, that the migration truly found its direction. To the north lay the Zagros Mountains and the path to the Levant and Europe. Some groups certainly splintered off in that direction, moving up the river valleys. But the bulk of this specific wave, the ancestors of most non-African people alive today, turned their faces toward the rising sun. They were drawn to the coast. The coast offered something the drying interior could not: reliability. No matter what the climate did, the ocean tides were constant. Twice a day, the sea retreated to reveal a buffet of high-protein food: shellfish, crabs, trapped fish, and seaweed. You didn't need to be a fast runner or a strong spear thrower to eat well on the coast. You just needed to be patient and observant. This reliance on beachcombing triggered a rapid expansion. Unlike hunters, who need vast territories to support a tribe, coastal foragers can live in higher densities. And when resources in one bay were exhausted, the solution was simple: just walk a few miles down the beach to the next bay. This birthed a unique migratory mechanism. They weren't trekking through the jungle or climbing mountains. They were following a single linear highway, the shoreline of the Indian Ocean. It was a route with few obstacles, a relatively flat corridor sandwiched between the mountains and the sea. The temperature was warm, the food was abundant, and the path was clear. As they moved out of the Arabian sphere and along the coast of Iran, they were leaving the familiar African-style ecology behind, for good. They were entering the realm of Asia. The tools they carried would begin to change, adapting to new materials like bamboo and different types of stone. Their skin tone, originally dark to protect against the equatorial African sun, would eventually begin to adapt to the new latitudes, though for now, clinging to the tropical rim, they remained much as they had been. They were now poised on the edge of the Indian subcontinent, moving rapidly. The Green Arabia had been the incubator, allowing their numbers to swell, but the drying of the desert had been the catalyst, the kick out the door that sent them streaming eastward. They had conquered the first great barrier of water and survived the first great shift in climate. Now, the highway of the Indian Ocean lay open before them, a road of sand and surf that stretched for thousands of miles toward the sunrise, promising new lands, new dangers, and the eventual domination of a new continent. Once the bands of humans had navigated the perimeter of the Arabian Peninsula and moved past the fertile mouth of the Persian Gulf, they found themselves staring down the barrel of one of the most efficient travel corridors in the history of our planet. Anthropologists and geneticists often refer to this next phase of the journey as the Southern Coastal Route or the Great Coastal Express. It is a concept that fundamentally changes how we visualize the peopling of the world. We tend to picture our ancestors fighting their way through dense jungles or struggling over snow-capped mountain peaks, and while that certainly happened later, the initial surge was likely far more pleasant. They simply went to the beach and turned left. This route stretched from the coast of modern-day Pakistan, down the western flank of India, around the tip of the subcontinent, and up toward the Bay of Bengal. It was a journey of thousands of miles, yet it offered a unique advantage that inland routes did not: consistency. If you are a hunter moving through the interior of a continent, every 100 miles might present a new ecosystem. You move from forest to scrubland to desert. The plants change, the animals change, and the dangers change. You have to constantly relearn how to survive, identifying which berries are poisonous and which predators are lurking in the tall grass. But the coast is a linear biome that remains remarkably stable. The specific species of shellfish might vary slightly from 1,000-mile stretch to the next, but the basic rules of the game remain the same. A limpet in Pakistan works much like a limpet in India. The tides operate on the same clock. The coconuts and mangroves provide the same resources. This meant that the migrants didn't need to reinvent their culture or their toolkit every generation. They could perfect the art of beachcombing and ride that single survival strategy halfway around the world. This lifestyle was not only easier, it was nutritionally superior. We discussed the omega-3 intake during the bottleneck phase, but here, on the southern route, it became a super fuel for expansion. These people were consuming high-protein, high-fat diets consisting of oysters, mussels, crabs, sea turtles, and fish trapped in tidal pools. This food didn't fight back. It didn't require the caloric expenditure of chasing down a gazelle for 3 days. It was abundant, predictable, and low risk. This allowed for higher birth rates and lower infant mortality. The bands grew larger and stronger, and as the local resources in one cove began to thin out under the pressure of the population, the solution was always visible on the horizon: just keep walking east. There is a ghostly quality to this part of the human story, however. If you go looking for the physical evidence of this migration, the campsites, the fire pits, the discarded shell middens, you will struggle to find them. This absence of evidence led early archaeologists to doubt the coastal theory for a long time. But the reason for the silence is geological, not historical. We have to remember the ice sheets. 60,000 years ago, sea levels were so low that the coastline was miles further out than it is today. The beaches our ancestors walked on, the caves they slept in, and the fires they built are now lying 300 feet beneath the Indian Ocean. We are effectively looking for a sunken civilization, a prehistoric Atlantis of nomads whose highway has been erased by the melting ice. Despite the submerged evidence, we know they were there because of the genetic breadcrumbs they left behind. This is where the story of mitochondrial DNA becomes pivotal. There is a specific genetic marker, a lineage known as haplogroup M. It is found in high frequencies in India, Southeast Asia, and among indigenous Australians, but it is virtually absent in Europe and the Middle East. This suggests that the people who carried this marker split off very early, bypassing the northern route entirely and sprinting along the southern rim of Asia. They were a distinct wave, moving with a speed that suggests they faced little competition. As they moved into the Indian subcontinent, they encountered the massive delta of the Indus River. Today, this region is largely arid, but back then, it was a labyrinth of marshes and waterways, a biodiversity hotspot that would have felt like a feast to these weary travelers. Crossing these great rivers would have required some ingenuity, likely the use of simple rafts or coracles made of hide and wood, but they were already people of the water's edge. India itself presented a fascinating landscape. It was recovering from the Toba eruption that had occurred thousands of years prior. Ash layers found in places like Jwalapuram in southern India show that the subcontinent had been blanketed in volcanic fallout, yet life had bounced back. As the modern humans pushed south along the Western Ghats, a mountain range that runs parallel to the western coast of India, they were entering a land that was lush, tropical, and teeming with life. Here, the pace of migration might have slowed down as the sheer abundance of the Indian tropics seduced the travelers. Why walk further when the fruit is heavy on the trees and the reef is full of fish? We see evidence of very deep ancient roots in the tribal populations of South India. Some of the modern indigenous groups in the Andaman Islands and the deep forests of Kerala carry genetic profiles that are incredibly ancient, representing some of the most direct, unbroken lines to those first coastal wanderers. They are the living descendants of the people who decided to stop walking and make this paradise their home. But not everyone stopped. The migratory impulse, driven by population pressure or simple curiosity, pushed the vanguard forward. They rounded the tip of India. At this time, the island of Sri Lanka was not an island at all. It was connected to the mainland by a broad land bridge, Palk Strait, which was then dry land. The migrants could walk all the way to the southern cliffs of Dandra Head without getting their feet wet. Archaeological finds in Sri Lanka, such as those at Fa Hian Cave, give us a glimpse of their sophistication. We find microliths, tiny stone blades, dating back to around 48,000 years ago, which is incredibly early. Even more impressive, we find evidence of bone tools and projectile points, suggesting that these people were hunting agile tree-dwelling monkeys and squirrels. This indicates that while they were masters of the coast, They were also capable of turning inland and mastering the rainforest when they needed to. They were adaptable. They weren't just stuck on the beach, they were using the beach as a base of operations to explore the interior. As they rounded the bend of India and moved up the eastern coast, the Bay of Bengal opened up before them. The coastline curved northward and then eastward again, leading them toward the chaotic geography of Southeast Asia. The easy linear walking was coming to an end. They were approaching a region where the land shattered into peninsulas and archipelagos, where the sea was both a barrier and a road. The speed of this movement is what truly stuns researchers. Genetic dating suggests that humans reached Australia as early as 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. If they left Africa around 60,000 years ago, that implies a blitzkrieg pace. They effectively walked from Yemen to Sydney in just a few thousand years. In geological time, that is instantaneous. It confirms the express nature of the coastal route. There were no high mountain ranges to cross, no deserts to traverse, and no winters to endure. It was a tropical sprint. By the time they reached the edge of what is now Myanmar and Thailand, these people had transformed. They were no longer just African survivors. They had become the masters of the tropical coast. They had encountered elephants in India that were different from the ones their ancestors knew in the Rift Valley. They had learned to navigate mangrove swamps and handle the monsoons. They carried with them the genetic diversity that would eventually populate all of Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. But as they pushed east, leaving the Indian subcontinent behind, they were unknowingly heading toward a collision. The lands of the north and the deep jungles of Asia were not empty. While the southern coast had been a relatively open road, the interior of the continent was occupied. Waiting in the wings were other actors on the stage of human evolution, cousins we had not seen for 500,000 years. The solitude of the coastal express was about to be broken by a meeting that would change our biology forever. The beachcombers were about to bump into the Neanderthals of the Levant and the mysterious Denisovans of the East. The isolation was over. While the coastal express was speeding along the warm, sun-drenched rim of the Indian Ocean, carrying one wave of humanity toward the sunrise, a different drama was unfolding to the north. Not every group turned right at the Persian Gulf. Some bands followed the freshwater arteries of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, pushing upwards into the Fertile Crescent. Others moved directly north from the Red Sea crossing, entering the corridor we now call the Levant, modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. This was not a highway to an empty world. It was a borderland, a geopolitical choke point where continents collided. And it was here, in the limestone caves of the Carmel mountain range and the Galilean hills, that our ancestors walked directly into the territory of a rival empire. For hundreds of thousands of years, this region had been the domain of the Neanderthals. It is time to dismantle the cartoonish image of the Neanderthal that persists in pop culture. These were not hulking, grunting ape men stumbling through the mud. They were the apex predators of the Eurasian frontier, a distinct human species that had evolved separately from us for 500,000 years. They were shorter and stockier than the slender, heat-adapted Africans arriving from the south, built like power lifters to conserve heat and wrestle large game. They had barrel chests, massive nasal cavities to warm the freezing air, and brains that were, on average, slightly larger than our own. The Levant was the meeting place. It was the only place on Earth where the two populations overlapped in such a confined space for such a long period. We know from the fossil record at sites like the Taboon and Skull caves that both species occupied this region, sometimes alternating possession of the same caves over thousands of years as the climate fluctuated. When it was warm, the African Homo sapiens pushed north. When the Ice Age cold snapped back, the Neanderthals pushed south. But inevitably, there were moments when they were there at the same time, drinking from the same streams and hunting the same gazelle herds. We can only speculate on what those first encounters looked like. Imagine a scouting party of modern humans, dark-skinned and tall, moving through the scrub oak forests of the Galilee. They come across a footprint in the mud, too wide, too deep to be one of their own. Later, they spot smoke rising from a cave mouth on a ridge. When the two groups finally stood face to face, the shock must have been profound. They were looking at reflections of themselves, yet distorted. The Neanderthals had pale skin, perhaps red hair, heavy brow ridges, and eyes that held an intelligence that was undeniable but alien. For a long time, archaeologists believed this was a war of extermination, a violent clash where the superior modern humans simply wiped out their cousins. But the story hidden in our blood tells a different, more intimate tale. In 2010, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome dropped a bombshell on the scientific community. Humans and Neanderthals didn't just fight, they mated. This interbreeding event was not a widespread, constant blending of populations. It was likely a series of rare, isolated trysts that happened right here in the Levant, around 55,000 years ago. It might have been a group of modern human hunters accepting a lone Neanderthal into their band, or a Romeo and Juliet scenario played out against a backdrop of Ice Age adversity. Whatever the social dynamics, the biological result was profound. Because the modern human population was still relatively small, these few hybridization events had a massive impact. The Neanderthal genes were injected into the Homo sapiens gene pool and then amplified as our species expanded. Today, if your ancestry lies anywhere outside of sub-Saharan Africa, whether you are European, Asian, Native American, or Australian Aboriginal, you carry the legacy of these encounters. Roughly 1.5% to 2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. You are a hybrid. This is not just junk DNA or a biological curiosity, it was a survival kit. When our ancestors left Africa, they were biologically naive. They were adapted to tropical diseases and parasites. But Eurasia was a biological minefield of new pathogens, ancient flu strains, tick-borne encephalitis, and Epstein-Barr viruses that the Neanderthals had been evolving defenses against for hundreds of millennia. When we interbred with them, we didn't just acquire their DNA, we hijacked their immune systems. We inherited a specific set of HLAs, human leukocyte antigens, that acted as a biological cheat code, allowing our ancestors to survive infections that might otherwise have wiped them out. We literally slept with the enemy to survive the winter. The exchange went beyond biology. There is growing evidence that we may have swapped technology and culture as well. In the Levant, we see a blurring of the lines in tool-making styles during this period. The Mousterian stone tool industry, typically associated with Neanderthals, begins to show up in sites occupied by modern humans. Did we learn a better way to scrape hides from them? Did they learn new vocalizations from us? The proximity was too close for ideas not to jump the gap. However, the coexistence in the Levant was not destined to last forever. The dynamic equilibrium eventually broke. Around 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, the modern humans began to gain the upper hand. Perhaps our social structures were more fluid, allowing us to form larger networks of trade and alliance, whereas the Neanderthals lived in smaller, more isolated family groups. Perhaps our projectile weapons, lighter spears and the beginnings of archery, gave us a hunting advantage over the Neanderthals, who relied on thrusting spears and close-quarters ambush tactics. Whatever the reason, the moderns began to push out of the Levant. They burst through the bottleneck. One branch turned west, aiming for the heart of Neanderthal territory in Europe. Another branch turned east, heading into the vastness of Central Asia. As they moved, they carried the Neanderthals with them, not as captives, but as ghosts in their cells. The pure Neanderthals of the Levant vanished, their caves abandoned or taken over by the newcomers. But their genetic contribution became a permanent passenger on the human journey. This moment in the Levant was the crucible. It was the filter through which humanity had to pass to become truly global. We entered the region as Africans, pure Homo sapiens. We emerged as something slightly different, a battle-hardened, genetically broadened species ready to tackle the high latitudes. We had picked up the keys to the north. As the bands of humans left the Mediterranean coast behind and ventured deeper into the Eurasian landmass, they were no longer just following the beach. They were becoming mountaineers and steppe hunters. The easy days of the Green Arabia and the Coastal Express were behind them. They were heading into a world of giants, mammoths, woolly rhinos, and cave bears, and deeper mysteries. The Levant had been the first test of their ability to coexist with another human species, but it wouldn't be the last. As the eastern wave pushed toward the Altai Mountains and the fringes of Siberia, they were walking toward a rendezvous with a ghost even more elusive than the Neanderthal, a cousin whose face we have never clearly seen, but whose shadow stretches across half the continent. As the migration pulse pushed eastward from the Levant, leaving the Mediterranean scrub behind, the landscape opened up into something far more daunting. The early human bands were now entering the heart of the Eurasian continent. This was not the linear, predictable highway of the coast. This was a sprawling, complex chessboard of high plateaus, river valleys, and mountain ranges that sliced through the clouds. To the north lay the deepening cold of the Siberian taiga. To the south, the humid subtropical forests of China and Southeast Asia. The humans who took this route were walking into a silence so profound it must have felt endless. But as we now know, they were not alone. If the Neanderthals are the well-known burly cousins of the human family tree, the Denisovans are the ghosts. Until the early 21st century, we had absolutely no idea they even existed. There were no famous skeletons in museums, no artistic reconstructions in textbooks. They were a complete phantom lineage, hidden in the dirt for 50,000 years. Their discovery is arguably the greatest detective story in the history of paleoanthropology, and it centers on a single, nondescript cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. In 2008, Russian archaeologists working in Denisova Cave found a tiny fragment of bone. It was the tip of a pinky finger belonging to a young girl, roughly 5 to 7 years old. It seemed insignificant, barely worth cataloging alongside the stone tools and animal bones found in the same layer. But when scientists pulverized that fragment and sequenced the DNA inside, they found something impossible. The genetic code did not match a modern human. It did not match a Neanderthal. It was a third distinct branch of humanity, a species that had split from the Neanderthals hundreds of thousands of years prior and drifted east, evolving in the isolation of Asia. We call them Denisovans after the cave, but that name is just a placeholder for a lost empire. While the Neanderthals held Europe and the Middle East, the Denisovans likely held a massive territory stretching from the freezing steppes of Siberia down to the tropical jungles of Laos and Vietnam. The fact that we found them in Siberia is just an accident of preservation. The cold cave air acted as a freezer, protecting the DNA. In reality, the heart of their population was probably much further south, in the warmer, resource-rich environments of East Asia. As our ancestors moved through this territory, the interbreeding event happened again. But this time, the encounter was different. The genetic signal suggests that the mixing with Denisovans was not a single, isolated affair like the Neanderthal tryst in the Levant. It seems to have happened in multiple waves, in different locations, over a long period. There were at least 2 distinct populations of Denisovans, one akin to the Siberian group and another, far more divergent group living perhaps in island Southeast Asia. Imagine the scene. A band of Homo sapiens, perhaps following the game trails along the foothills of the Himalayas or navigating the bamboo forests of the Mekong Basin. They encounter a people who are robust, dark-skinned, and adapted to the local environment in ways the newcomers are not. We still don't have a clear picture of what a Denisovan looked like. We only have a few teeth, a jawbone, and that pinky finger. But DNA methylation maps suggest they had wide skulls, strong jaws, and a pelvic shape distinct from ours. They were formidable. When these 2 groups mixed, the biological exchange was once again a game changer. The Denisovans gave us gifts that allowed us to conquer specific Asian environments. The most famous example is found today in the Sherpa and Tibetan populations living on the roof of the world. Surviving at high altitudes where oxygen levels are dangerously low is incredibly difficult. Most lowlanders suffer from hypoxia. Their blood thickens as it desperately tries to capture more oxygen, leading to strokes and heart failure. But Tibetans don't have this problem. They breathe easily. It turns out they are running on Denisovan software. They carry a specific variant of a gene called EPAS1, which regulates the body's production of hemoglobin. This gene prevents their blood from thickening. It is a super athlete gene, and it didn't evolve in Homo sapiens. We stole it. Or rather, we inherited it from a Denisovan ancestor who likely lived on the Tibetan plateau tens of thousands of years ago. Without this genetic loan, the permanent human colonization of the Himalayas might never have been possible. But the legacy goes deeper. As we track the migration further south and east towards the ocean, the Denisovan signal gets louder. In mainland Asia, the genetic percentage is small, a fraction of a percent. But as you cross into the islands, into the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Australia, the numbers jump. The indigenous peoples of Melanesia and the Aboriginal Australians carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA. This is a massive amount. It implies that the ancestors of these ocean-going people met a large, thriving population of Denisovans somewhere in Southeast Asia, interbreeding with them extensively before moving on to cross the sea. This paints a radical new picture of the Asian landscape 60,000 years ago. It wasn't an empty wilderness waiting for us. It was a cosmopolitan world. You had Homo sapiens pushing in from the west. You had Neanderthals lurking in the Altai and pushing east. You had Denisovans dominating the center and south. And on the islands of Indonesia, you even had the tiny Homo floresiensis, the hobbits, living in isolation. It was a Middle Earth of competing hominids, trading genes, tools, and perhaps stories. The cultural capacity of the Denisovans is also beginning to emerge from the shadows. In the same layer of the cave where the pinky bone was found, archaeologists discovered a stunning artifact, a bracelet made of green chlorite stone. It was polished to a glass-like sheen and drilled with a precision that suggests a high-speed drill, technology we previously thought was thousands of years in the future. If this bracelet was indeed made by Denisovans, it shatters our superiority complex. It suggests they had an appreciation for beauty, a mastery of complex stoneworking, and the time for artistic expression. They were not just surviving, they were creating. Eventually, the Denisovans faded away. We don't know if it was due to direct conflict, competition for resources, or simply being genetically swamped by the endless waves of modern humans arriving from Africa. But they didn't really die out. They live on in the immune systems of modern Asians, in the blood of Tibetans, and in the deep ancestry of the Pacific Islanders. We absorbed them. As the human wave continued its relentless push, leaving the mainland of Asia behind, the geography began to transform dramatically. The path was leading them toward the edge of the continental shelf. The world was about to change from a landscape of mountains and steppes to a water world of islands and drowned continents. The sea levels, still suppressed by the Ice Age, had created a unique geographical anomaly in Southeast Asia, a massive landmass that doesn't exist on modern maps. This was the next great stage for the migrants. They were about to step onto the lost continent of Sundaland. The Denisovan chapter teaches us that the conquest of the planet was not a solo act. We are a mosaic species. We are African in our core, but as we trekked through Asia, we picked up the armor and the keys of the people who were there before us. We are the sum of all the humans who have ever lived, even the ones who are no longer here to tell their own stories. With this hybrid vigor coursing through their veins, our ancestors stood on the shores of the South China Sea, looking out at a horizon that was vastly different from the one we see today. The water was low, the land was high, and the way forward beckoned them into the tropical heart of the drowned world. To understand the next phase of the human journey, we have to erase the map of Southeast Asia as we know it today. If you look at a modern globe, the region is a fragmented scatter of islands, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, separated by shallow seas. It looks like a shattered puzzle. But 60,000 years ago, the pieces of that puzzle were firmly locked together. The same global freeze that sucked moisture from the air and lowered sea levels by hundreds of feet didn't just narrow the Red Sea. It exposed a subcontinent the size of Europe that has since vanished beneath the waves. Geologists call this lost world Sundaland. For the bands of humans pushing down from the Asian mainland, from what is now Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar, there was no coastline where we see one today. They didn't stop at the beach because the beach wasn't there. Instead, they walked out onto a vast low-lying plain that stretched for thousands of miles. They could walk from Saigon to Singapore, and then keep walking to Jakarta and Borneo without ever getting their feet wet. This was not a series of island hops. It was a trek across a massive solid extension of the Asian continent. Sundaland was a spectacular environment, a Garden of Eden in the truest sense of the biological term. Because it sat on the equator, it remained warm and humid, even while the rest of the planet was shivering in the grip of the Ice Age. It became a sanctuary for life. The lowlands that are now the floor of the Java Sea were then covered in a mosaic of dense tropical rainforests, mangrove swamps, and broad corridors of savanna grassland. It was a landscape that breathed. Dominating this drowned continent were river systems that rivaled the Amazon. We can still trace their dried-up beds on the ocean floor using sonar. These ghost rivers collected rainwater from the mountains of Sumatra and Borneo, merging into massive sluggish waterways that wound their way north to empty into the South China Sea. For early humans, these rivers were the arteries of existence. They were the highways through the dense jungle, offering easy transport and an endless supply of freshwater fish. The banks of these great lost rivers would have been lined with campsites, the smoke of cooking fires drifting over water that is now buried under 50 meters of salt ocean. The biodiversity here was staggering. Because the land bridges were open, animals from the mainland poured into Sundaland. Elephants tramped across the plains that connected Malaysia to Sumatra. Tigers stalked deer through forests that now exist only as coral reefs. Rhinoceroses, leopards, and orangutans moved freely across this unified landmass. For the human hunters, this was a land of plenty. The skills they had honed on the mainland, the ambush tactics, the knowledge of bamboo technology, the processing of toxic plants, applied perfectly here. There was no need for radical adaptation. It was simply more of the good life. This abundance likely led to a population boom. Sundaland acted as a pump. It drew people in from the north, allowed their numbers to swell in the rich tropical environment, and then, as the population pressure grew, pushed them toward the edges. It is fascinating to think that the center of civilization in this region for thousands of years was not on the islands we see today, but in the valleys between them, the very places that are now inaccessible to us. The archaeological record of Southeast Asia is inherently incomplete because the best real estate, the places where most people would have lived, are underwater. We are only finding the campsites of the people who lived in the highlands, the areas that remained above water to become the modern islands. But life on Sundaland was not static. It was a landscape defined by the slow rhythmic breathing of the ocean. Over the millennia, as the global climate flickered, the sea levels would rise and fall. There were times when the water crept up, turning hills into islands and isolating populations for centuries, only to recede again and reconnect them. This pulsing geography likely drove innovation. It forced people to be flexible, to switch between being deep forest hunters and coastal foragers. It taught them to read the tides, and arguably, it forced the invention of better watercraft. You cannot live in a land of giant rivers and encroaching seas without learning how to build a decent boat. As the migration wave filtered through this massive rainforest continent, moving generally southeast, they eventually approached the limits of the continental shelf. Sundaland was vast, but it wasn't infinite. The eastern edge of this landmass was marked by a geological cliff, a sharp drop-off into the abyssal depths of the ocean. This boundary is invisible to the naked eye on the surface, but the ocean tells the truth. The water changes from the turquoise blue of the shallow shelf to the inky, terrifying black of the deep trench. This boundary is one of the most significant lines on the planet, known to biologists as the Wallace Line, named after the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace. To the west of the line, on Sundaland, the animals are Asian: tigers, elephants, monkeys, bears. To the east of the line, the world changes abruptly. The animals become strange, marsupial, and ancient: tree kangaroos, cuscus, and monitor lizards. This is because the deep water trench prevented land animals from crossing, even when sea levels were at their lowest. The two biological worlds had evolved in isolation for millions of years, separated by a narrow but impassable strip of deep water. For the humans arriving at the eastern edge of Borneo or Bali, this was the end of the road. They stood on the shore and looked out across the Makassar Strait or the Lombok Strait. The land on the other side, the islands of Sulawesi and Lombok, was visible. It was right there, a hazy purple silhouette on the horizon. But unlike the shallow, calm waters they had navigated so far, this water was treacherous. It was a churning channel of fast-moving currents, a through-flow where the Pacific Ocean pours billions of gallons of water into the Indian Ocean. This was the first true barrier the Great Migration had faced since leaving Africa. The Red Sea had been a narrow hop, the rivers of India had been swimmable or raftable. But the Wallace Line was different. You couldn't walk across it, and you couldn't accidentally drift across it on a log. The currents would sweep you out to sea to die of thirst long before you reached the other side. Crossing this line required something new. It required intent. It is here, on the edge of the drowned continent, that humanity made a leap that separates us from every other animal. We stopped being unintentional migrants following the herds and became explorers. Someone, or some group, stood on that beach in Borneo, looked at the distant island across the crashing waves, and decided to go there. They didn't know what was on the other side. They couldn't smell the food or see the predators. They just knew that there was land, and that was enough. This decision marks the beginning of the maritime era. To cross the Wallace Line, they likely had to build substantial rafts, perhaps lashing together dozens of giant bamboo stalks, a material that is incredibly buoyant and abundant in Sundaland. They would have needed paddles, and more importantly, they would have needed a plan to carry fresh water. This wasn't a casual afternoon trip. It was a voyage into the void. The existence of Sundaland is a poignant reminder of the transience of our world. The people who lived there, who hunted in those great valleys and fished in those ghost rivers, had no idea that their home was temporary. When the Ice Age eventually ended and the Great Melt began around 15,000 years ago, the sea rushed back in. It flooded the plains, turning the hilltops into the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. It forced the populations to retreat higher and higher, compressing them into smaller territories. Some anthropologists speculate that the drowning of Sundaland is the root of the universal Great Flood myths found in cultures across Southeast Asia, and perhaps even further afield. It was a slow-motion apocalypse that erased a continent, leaving only the high ground we see today. But 60,000 years ago, that cataclysm was still far in the future. For our ancestors, Sundaland was a solid, endless bridge that carried them safely to the edge of the known world, delivering them to the jumping-off point for the most audacious journey yet, the open ocean crossing to a place that had never known the tread of a human foot. The continent of Sahul, Australia, was waiting. Standing on the limestone cliffs of islands like Timor or Roti, looking south across the Timor Sea, the first mariners of our species faced a challenge that was fundamentally different from anything their ancestors had encountered in Africa or Asia. The water here was deep, the currents were violent, and the destination was often invisible or barely a smudge on the horizon. This was the crossing of the Wallace Line, a biogeographical border so absolute that it had separated evolutionary experiments for tens of millions of years. To cross it was to leave the familiar biological world of monkeys, tigers, and placental mammals behind and step into a realm that had been evolving in isolation since the time of the dinosaurs. The landmass awaiting them was Sahul. Today, we know its fragmented parts as Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, but 65,000 years ago, lower sea levels had fused them into a single colossal continent. It was a land of extremes, rainforests in the north, alpine glaciers in the south, and a vast, red, arid heart. But reaching it required the invention of the first true maritime technology in human history. This was not an accidental drift. While a single log might carry a lizard to a new island, it cannot carry a viable human population. To colonize Sahul, you need men and women. You need a breeding group. Genetic models suggest that the founding population of indigenous Australia was likely a group of at least 100 to 200 people, or perhaps smaller groups arriving in waves over a short period. This implies organization. It implies language. It implies that people sat down on the beaches of Sundaland, designed a craft, probably elaborate bamboo rafts with steered paddles, and convinced their families to board them. They were launching into the void, driven by a spirit of exploration or perhaps the pressure of competition behind them. When the keels of their rafts finally scraped against the sand of the Sahul shoreline, perhaps on the Kimberley coast or the protruding shelf of what is now the Arafura Sea, the travelers stepped into an alien planet. The sensory shock must have been immediate. The trees looked different. The eucalyptus forests were gray-green and ghost-like, smelling of oil and menthol. The birds screamed with voices they had never heard, the raucous calls of cockatoos and parrots. But the true strangeness lay in the animals. Sahul was the kingdom of the megafauna, and it was a marsupial world. There were no lions or hyenas here. Instead, the apex predator was Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. It was about the size of a leopard but built like a brick wall, with retractable claws and a bolt-cutter jaw that could snap a femur in half. Stalking the grasslands was Megalania, a dragon-like monitor lizard that grew up to 20 feet long, possessing a venomous bite that bled its victims to death. But there were also giants that were potential prey. The new arrivals would have stared up at the Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a hippopotamus lumbering through the salt bush. They would have seen Genyornis, a flightless thunderbird standing 2 meters tall, and giant kangaroos that stood 3 meters high with faces that looked bizarrely short and flat. This was a biological laboratory that had never seen a human. The animals had no evolutionary fear of these two-legged creatures. They didn't know that the small, fragile-looking beings holding thin sticks were the most dangerous predators on Earth. This naivety likely spelled their doom. The extinction of the Australian megafauna is a hotly debated topic, but the timeline is suspicious. Shortly after humans arrived, the giants began to vanish. It probably wasn't a blitzkrieg slaughter, but rather a slow death by 1,000 cuts. Humans hunted the juveniles, or perhaps they competed for the same food sources. But the humans also brought a weapon more powerful than any spear: fire. The colonization of Australia marks the beginning of the fire stick farming era. The new inhabitants quickly learned that the Australian landscape responded to flame. By burning patches of scrub, they could clear the undergrowth, flush out small game, and encourage the growth of fresh green grass that would attract kangaroos. Over thousands of years, this practice fundamentally engineered the continent. It favored fire-resistant plants like eucalyptus and transformed dense forests into open woodlands. The indigenous people didn't just inhabit Sahul, they curated it. They became the architects of their own ecosystem, maintaining a delicate balance that allowed them to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The expansion across Sahul was rapid. New archaeological evidence from the Majed Baby rock shelter in northern Australia places humans there as early as 65,000 years ago. This date is revolutionary because it pushes back the entire timeline of the global migration. It suggests that humans sprinted out of Africa and reached Australia almost immediately in geological terms. From the northern landing points, they spread quickly. Some moved up into the high mountains of New Guinea, where they would eventually independently invent agriculture, cultivating yams and bananas in highland valleys. Others pushed south into the vast, drying interior. This required incredible adaptation. The people who conquered the Australian desert were the ultimate survivors. They learned to map the land not with paper, but with song. The song lines are essentially oral maps, intricate stories that describe the location of waterholes, landmarks, and spiritual sites. By singing the song of a particular track, a traveler could navigate across hundreds of miles of featureless desert, knowing exactly where to dig for water or which rocks to avoid. This mental technology allowed them to occupy the dead heart of the continent, a place where European explorers would later perish from thirst while surrounded by hidden resources they didn't know how to see. Eventually, the pioneers reached the southern extremes of the continent. They walked across the Bassian Plain, the land bridge that is now the Bass Strait, and entered Tasmania. At the time, this was the southernmost outpost of humanity. During the height of the Ice Age, Tasmania was a tundra, piercingly cold and glaciated. The people here were cut off when the sea levels eventually rose, isolating them from the mainland for 10,000 years, the longest isolation of any human group in history. Yet they survived, maintaining their culture in a world of wind and ice. The colonization of Sahul is the ultimate proof of human plasticity. In a few thousand years, the same genetic stock that had evolved on the savannas of Africa had successfully adapted to the rainforests of New Guinea, the deserts of the outback, and the cold hinterlands of Tasmania. They had crossed the ocean, defeated monsters, and learned to manage an entire continent with fire. But while this southern drama was unfolding, the other half of the human story was turning north. Back on the Asian mainland, the Great Coastal Express had not taken everyone south. Some groups had peeled off. They turned their backs on the ocean and looked toward the great forbidding interior of the Eurasian landmass. They were heading into the teeth of the Ice Age, toward the Mammoth Steppe. The tropical phase of our history was over for them. They were about to trade their bamboo rafts for fur parkas, and the challenges they would face would forge a new kind of human, one capable of surviving in a world where the air itself could freeze your lungs. While the mariners of the South were navigating the turquoise waters of the Arafura Sea, a different vanguard of humanity was facing a challenge that was arguably even more hostile. These were the groups that had turned north from the warm latitude of the Levant and the Iranian plateau, pushing into the vast open interior of Central Asia. They were entering a biome that no longer exists on Earth today, the Mammoth Steppe. When we think of the Ice Age, we often picture deep snow and endless blizzards, a white wasteland similar to modern Antarctica. But the Mammoth Steppe was different. It was a cold, dry, hyper-productive grassland that stretched all the way from Spain to Canada, spanning the entire top of the world. Because so much water was locked up in ice sheets, the air was incredibly dry. This prevented heavy snowfall. Instead of deep drifts, the ground was covered in a carpet of hardy grasses, herbs, and low shrubs that remained accessible all winter long. This endless sea of grass supported a biomass of animals that rivals the modern African Serengeti. Herds of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, and reindeer numbered in the millions. It was a meat locker of epic proportions. For a hunter, it was paradise. But there was a catch: the temperature. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to 40 degrees below zero. In these conditions, exposed skin freezes in minutes, and the calorie demands of the human body skyrocket. A naked African ape, evolved to dissipate heat on the savanna, should not have been able to survive here for a single night. The conquest of the Mammoth Steppe is not a story of biological evolution. We didn't grow fur or layers of blubber. It is a story of technological revolution. This is the moment where human ingenuity defeated biology. The most important invention of this era was not a weapon, but a small sliver of bone with a hole drilled in one end, the eyed needle. Before the needle, clothing was likely just draped hides or furs tied together with thongs, clunky, drafty, and inefficient. But the eyed needle allowed for the invention of tailoring. For the first time, humans could sew complex, multi-layered garments. They could create fitted trousers, hooded parkas, and boots that sealed tight against the ankles. This was the birth of the microclimate. By wearing tailored fur clothing, these hunters carried a bubble of tropical air with them wherever they went. They could stand in a howling Siberian gale and remain at a balmy temperature inside their reindeer skin suits. This mastery of thermodynamics was the key that unlocked the north. As they moved deeper into the steppe, into modern-day Kazakhstan, Russia, and Mongolia, they faced another problem: shelter. In the open grassland, there were no caves to hide in and no forests to provide timber. The landscape was terrifyingly exposed, so they built their own architecture using the only building material available in abundance: the bones of their prey. The mammoth bone houses found at sites like Mezherych in Ukraine and Malta in Siberia are marvels of prehistoric engineering. These were not temporary tents. They were semi-permanent fortresses against the cold. The builders would stack the massive lower jawbones of mammoths in a circle to form a foundational wall, interlocking them in a herringbone pattern that provided structural stability. Ribs were arched over the top to create a roof frame, likely covered with thick hides and weighed down with tusks. Inside these bone cathedrals, life was surprisingly comfortable. Excavations reveal hearths for heating, separate areas for working stone and bone, and even pits dug into the permafrost to act as natural refrigerators for storing meat. These structures suggest a society that was settling down, at least for the long winter months. They weren't running constantly. They were hunkering down, processing the massive kills they had made during the autumn migration. The prey itself shaped their culture. Hunting a 6-ton woolly mammoth was not a task for a lone wolf. It required complex coordination, foresight, and courage. These people likely used the landscape itself as a weapon, driving herds into natural bottlenecks, swampy mire, or over cliffs where they could be dispatched safely. A single kill provided tons of meat, fat for fuel, since wood was scarce, they burned bone and fat, and materials for housing and clothing. The mammoth was the center of their economy, their home depot, and their grocery store rolled into one. Life on the steppe also rewired the human social network. To survive in such low population densities, where a single band might be the only humans for hundreds of miles, you needed insurance. You needed to know that if the hunt failed, you had somewhere to turn. We see evidence of vast trading networks emerging during this time. Exotic materials like marine shells from the distant coast or specific types of high-quality flint moved thousands of miles across the steppe. This implies that different groups were meeting, trading, and perhaps arranging marriages to avoid inbreeding. They were building a social safety net across the frozen plains. The people of the Mammoth Steppe also developed a rich inner life, perhaps as a way to cope with the long, dark winters. This is the era of the Venus figurines, small carved statuettes of voluptuous female figures found all across Eurasia, from France to Lake Baikal. Their ubiquity suggests a shared culture or belief system that spanned the entire continent. They were also carving intricate animals out of ivory, flying swans, stalking lions, capturing the essence of the creatures they shared their world with. One specific group of these steppe hunters, the Malta-Bure culture near Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, is particularly important to our history. Genetic studies of a young boy buried there 24,000 years ago reveal a specific signature: ancient North Eurasians. This group is a ghost population that no longer exists in pure form, but they are the missing link between the peoples of Europe and the Americas. They carried the genetic toolkit that would eventually cross the Bering Land Bridge. They were the ones who cracked the code of the High North. As they pushed further east and north, chasing the herds, they were honing the skills that would eventually allow humans to enter the Arctic Circle. They learned to read the snow and ice. They likely developed snowshoes to walk over deep drifts and sleds to haul their heavy gear. They were becoming distinct from their cousins back in the tropical south. Their skin likely lightened to absorb more ultraviolet radiation from the weak northern sun, synthesizing vital vitamin D. Their bodies became stockier to conserve heat. The conquest of the Mammoth Steppe was a crucible. It filtered out the weak and rewarded the innovative. It turned the human species from a tropical primate into a planetary generalist. By 30,000 years ago, humans were not just surviving the cold, they were thriving in it. They had turned the most inhospitable environment on Earth into a home, insulated by fur, heated by bonfires, and fed by the giants of the Ice Age. But while the eastern wing of this northern expansion was pushing toward Siberia, the western wing was heading into a different kind of confrontation. As they moved west from the Central Asian steppes into the peninsula of Europe, they were entering a land that was already occupied. The Neanderthals of Europe were dug in, masters of their own domain. The stage was set for the final replacement, a cultural and genetic overtaking that would leave Homo sapiens as the sole proprietors of the Western world. The steppe hunters were coming, and they were bringing their needles, their art, and their overwhelming numbers with them. As the great human diaspora fanned out across the globe, a significant branch of the family tree turned its attention westward. Leaving the steppes of Central Asia and the crossroads of the Near East, these pioneers entered the continent of Europe. This was not the tame, manicured landscape of modern vineyards and farmlands. 45,000 years ago, Europe was a wild, throbbing frontier of ice and tundra, a place where the mountains were jagged with glaciers and the valleys echoed with the calls of cave lions and hyenas. But more importantly, it was already taken. This was the fortress of the Neanderthals, the land they had evolved in, adapted to, and ruled for nearly 400,000 years. The entry into Europe was likely led along the great river artery of the Danube. This massive waterway acted as a natural highway, cutting through the dense forests and mountains, offering a clear path from the Black Sea deep into the heart of the continent. Archaeologists trace this movement through the sudden appearance of a new, sophisticated toolkit known as the Aurignacian industry. Wherever these tools appear in the sediment layers, they signal the arrival of the moderns. The collision between the incoming Homo sapiens and the resident Neanderthals in Europe was different from the earlier tentative meetings in the Levant. This was the final act. The modern humans were arriving in larger numbers, armed with the technologies perfected on the steppes: tailored clothing, superior projectile weapons, and vast social networks. The Neanderthals, by contrast, were struggling. Their populations had always been small and scattered, but now, faced with a competitor who exploited the same resources with ruthless efficiency, they began to fade. We don't need to imagine a prehistoric genocide to explain their disappearance. It was likely a game of numbers and calories. If a band of modern humans moved into a valley and hunted the reindeer herds more effectively with their lighter, longer-ranged spears, perhaps aided by spear throwers or atlatls, the Neanderthals in the neighboring valley would simply find it harder to feed their children. Over a few thousand years, a slight difference in infant mortality rates is enough to drive one population to extinction while the other booms. The Neanderthals were pushed to the margins, to the high mountains and the peninsulas, retreating into the shadows as the newcomers claimed the best hunting grounds. But the most striking aspect of this conquest was not the violence, but the beauty. As modern humans swept into Europe, they unleashed a creative explosion that has no parallel in previous history. This period is often called the Great Leap Forward. It seems that something in the human brain had finally clicked into place, or perhaps the social density of the migration sparked a cultural renaissance. Suddenly, art was everywhere. Deep in the limestone caves of France and Spain, these people began to paint. The Chauvet Cave in southern France, dating back roughly 30,000 to 35,000 years, contains some of the most breathtaking art ever created. These are not crude stick figures. They are masterful three-dimensional renderings of lions, rhinoceroses, and horses, drawn with charcoal and ochre. The artists used the natural contours of the rock wall to give the animals muscle and volume. When the flickering light of a torch played across the walls, the animals would seem to move, a prehistoric cinema flickering in the dark. This art was not just decoration, it was likely spiritual or magical, a way to commune with the forces of nature. It signals a brain capable of high-level abstract thought. They were creating symbols, externalizing their memories and myths. In Germany, in the Hohenstein-Stadel cave, excavators found the Lion Man, a statuette carved from mammoth ivory. It depicts a creature with the head of a cave lion and the body of a man. This is a profound object. It represents something that does not exist in the real world. To conceive of a lion man requires imagination, the ability to dream of things that are unreal. This ability to believe in shared fictions, gods, spirits, tribes, is perhaps the true superpower that allowed Homo sapiens to organize large groups and conquer the world. They also brought music. In caves in the Swabian Jura of Germany, we have found flutes carved from vulture wing bones and mammoth ivory. These delicate instruments, with carefully drilled finger holes, are over 40,000 years old. They utilize the pentatonic scale, the same scale used in much of modern blues and rock music. Imagine a group of these early Europeans sitting around a fire in the deep winter, clad in fur, listening to a melody played on a bone flute. It humanizes them in a way that bones and stones never can. They were us. They felt joy, sorrow, and awe. As the Aurignacian culture spread west, reaching the Atlantic coast, the Neanderthals continued their slow retreat. Their final holdouts were in the Iberian Peninsula. The Rock of Gibraltar, jutting out into the Mediterranean, served as their last fortress. In Gorham's Cave, on the sheer cliffs of the rock, we find evidence of some of the very last Neanderthals living there around 24,000 to 28,000 years ago. They were cooking mussels, hunting ibex, and perhaps looking out across the water toward Africa, the continent their rivals had come from. There is a tragic poignancy to the Neanderthal extinction. They were not primitive in the way we used to think. They buried their dead, they cared for their disabled, they likely had language. But they were rigid. They were specialists of the ambush hunt, adapted to a specific way of life that couldn't keep up with the fluid, adaptable genius of the modern humans. When the last Neanderthal died, perhaps alone in a cave overlooking the sea or in a small, starving family group, an entire way of being human vanished from the earth. We were truly alone, but the victory was bittersweet. The Europe that the modern humans had conquered was about to turn on them. The climate, which had been fluctuating, began to trend toward a deep, brutal freeze. The relatively mild interstadial periods were ending. The glaciers in the north began to grow, creeping south from Scandinavia and down from the Alps. The Garden of Eden of the steppe tundra was about to become a freezer. The population that had just established itself, painting the caves and hunting the great herds, found themselves facing a climate catastrophe. The last glacial maximum was approaching. This was not just a cold snap, it was a climatic vice that would squeeze the life out of the continent. The vast herds would move or die off. The habitable zones would shrink. The humans of Europe, fresh from their victory over the Neanderthals, would be tested to their absolute limits. This environmental pressure forced the populations to contract. They abandoned the northern plains of England, Germany, and Poland, fleeing south toward the refugia, the warmer pockets of southern France, Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. It was in these crowded refugees during the height of the freeze that the unique genetic profile of modern Europeans was cooked in the pressure cooker. The art became even more intense, the technology even more refined. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, which came later than Chauvet, were created during or right after this deep freeze, perhaps as a desperate prayer for abundance in a starving world. The replacement of the Neanderthals was the end of the two-human world. From this point on, Homo sapiens was the solitary master of the continent. We had absorbed a few of their genes, stolen their caves, and outlasted their lineage. But as the ice sheets ground relentlessly southward, swallowing the landscape mile by mile, the survivors must have wondered if they too were destined to fade away into the frost. The conquest of Europe was complete, but the battle against the planet itself was just entering its deadliest phase. The conquest of the planet, which had been moving at such a breathless pace, sweeping across the tropics, island-hopping to Australia, and piercing the European frontier, was about to hit a wall. Or rather, a wall of ice. Around 26,000 years ago, the global thermostat broke. The slow cooling trend that had been shadowing the human journey suddenly accelerated, plunging the Earth into the last glacial maximum, or the LGM. This was the absolute nadir of the Ice Age. It was the moment when the cryosphere, the frozen parts of the planet, flexed its muscles and tried to reclaim the globe. Massive ice sheets, some over 2 miles thick, crushed the northern hemisphere. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet buried everything from Canada down to New York City and Chicago. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet swallowed Scandinavia, the Baltic Sea, and most of Great Britain, reaching its icy fingers down into northern Germany and Poland. To understand the scale of this, imagine standing in modern-day London or Berlin. In the depths of the LGM, these places were uninhabitable wastelands, akin to the interior of Greenland today. They were polar deserts scoured by katabatic winds, ferocious high-density gales that rolled off the top of the glaciers, screaming down the ice slopes at hurricane speeds. Nothing could live there. The human expansion, for the first time in 40,000 years, did not just stop, it retreated. The map of the human world shrank. The bands of hunters who had bravely ventured into the northern plains of Europe and Russia were forced to flee. They were chased south by the encroaching ice, squeezed into smaller and smaller territories. This was the era of the refugia. The entire human population of Western Eurasia was compressed into a few relatively warm pockets in southern Europe, the Franco-Cantabrian region encompassing southern France and northern Spain, the Italian peninsula, the Balkans, and the Ukraine river valleys. Life in these refugia was intense. Imagine the population density of a continent squeezed into the size of a single state. Different tribes, perhaps speaking different dialects and carrying different traditions, were forced to live cheek by jowl. This proximity likely acted as a cultural pressure cooker. It is no coincidence that the most spectacular cave art, the thundering bisons of Altamira and the intricate engravings of Lascaux, dates to roughly this period or its immediate aftermath. When you are trapped in a valley with winter howling outside, ritual and art become essential glue to keep society from fracturing. The technology of survival also reached a peak of deadly elegance. In the Franco-Cantabrian refuge, a culture known as the Solutrean emerged. Their flint knapping skills were unparalleled. They created laurel leaf points, spear tips that are so thin, symmetrical, and delicate that some archaeologists believe they were not meant to be used but admired. They are works of art in stone, symbols of status or offerings to the spirits of the hunt. But they were also lethal. These people were hunting horses and reindeer in deep snow, requiring weapons that could pierce thick winter hides with minimal effort. While Europe huddled in its caves, a similar drama was playing out on the other side of the Eurasian landmass in the east. The mammoth steppe, which had been a productive grassland, turned harsh and dry. The desertification of Central Asia severed the connection between east and west. The human populations in Siberia were pushed to the absolute limit. In these eastern badlands, survival required a shift in diet and architecture that bordered on the extreme. At sites like Mezherych in Ukraine, which remained occupied as an eastern refuge, the reliance on mammoths became total. With no trees left on the wind-scoured steppe, bones became the only fuel. But bone is hard to burn. It requires a specific high-heat starter fire to get going, after which the marrow fat inside the bone burns with a slow, greasy, intense heat. These people were literally burning the skeletons of their prey to stay alive. This deep freeze also had a profound effect on the oceans. With so much water locked up in the continental ice sheets, global sea levels dropped to their lowest point, roughly 120 meters below where they are today. The continental shelves were exposed entirely. The coastal express route that had brought humans out of Africa was now a stranded inland highway miles from the sea. But this drop in sea level created a new geography that would change history. In the far northeast of Siberia, the receding waters exposed the floor of the Bering Sea. It connected Siberia to Alaska, creating a land bridge not just a few miles wide, but 1,000 miles wide. This was Beringia. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a subcontinent, a lost country roughly the size of Australia. While the rest of the world was retreating into refugia, a specific group of sturdy Siberians, descendants of those ancient North Eurasians we met earlier, was pushed by the cold toward this new landmass. They weren't trying to get to America. They were simply following the herds of bison and mammoth that were seeking refuge on the land bridge itself. You see, Beringia was a climate anomaly. Because the massive ice sheets blocked the moisture from the Pacific, snow couldn't fall heavily there. While the rest of the north was buried under ice, Beringia remained a dry, shrubby tundra grassland. It was a sanctuary in the middle of the frozen world. The herds moved there to eat the dwarf willows and grasses that poked through the thin snow cover, and the humans followed. But as the LGM deepened, the door slammed shut behind them. The ice sheets in North America grew so large that they coalesced, blocking the way south. Simultaneously, the glaciers in the Verkhoyansk range of eastern Siberia grew, blocking the way back west. These people were trapped. They were isolated on the Beringian landmass, cut off from their Asian ancestors and barred from the American continent ahead. This isolation is one of the most critical pauses in human history. Geneticists call it the Beringian standstill. For thousands of years, perhaps as many as 5 to 8,000 years, this population lived in complete genetic isolation on the land bridge. They were a small group, perhaps only a few thousand individuals. In this solitude, the unique genetic mutations that characterize indigenous Americans today were incubated. They ceased to be Siberians and became something new, the Beringians. The LGM was a bottleneck, a brutal filter that tested the adaptability of our species. In Europe, it selected for social complexity and artistic expression as people crowded together. In the Arctic East, it selected for extreme physical resilience and the ability to process high-fat diets. We can picture a winter night during the LGM 20,000 years ago. The sky is a crystal-clear vault of stars, untouched by light pollution, shimmering with the aurora borealis. The temperature is 50 below zero. In a tent made of mammoth skins in Beringia, a family huddles together under a pile of furs. The air inside smells of burning bone and fermented fat. Outside, the wind howls across a landscape that is now at the bottom of the ocean. These people are the ultimate survivors. They are waiting for the sun to return, waiting for the ice to crack, waiting for the world to open up again. They endured this white darkness for millennia. They had no idea that they were the chosen few who would eventually unlock 2 entire continents. They were simply trying to keep the fire lit. The LGM was the pause before the final sprint. It stored up the potential energy of the human species, compressing it like a spring. When the melt finally began, that spring would uncoil with explosive force, launching humanity into its final and most spectacular expansion. But first, they had to survive the long, long winter. The concept of a bridge implies movement, a structure you cross to get from point A to point B. But for the thousands of years that humanity stood on the threshold of the Americas, Beringia was not a bridge. It was a homeland. It was a vast, sprawling subcontinent that existed between 2 massive walls of ice, a place where time seemed to stand still while the rest of the world froze. To understand the people who would eventually become the first Americans, we must stop thinking of them as travelers passing through and start seeing them as the inhabitants of a lost civilization that now lies beneath the cold gray waves of the Bering Strait. This period is known in scientific circles as the Beringian standstill. Genetic clocks tell us that the ancestors of Native Americans split from their Siberian cousins around 23,000 years ago, but they didn't populate the Americas until roughly 15,000 years ago. That leaves a gap of nearly 8,000 years. Where were they? They weren't marching. They were living, dying, and evolving right there on the land bridge. Imagine a territory roughly the size of Texas and California combined, but one that appears on no modern map. This was central Beringia. While the LGM had buried Canada under the Laurentide ice sheet and Europe under the Fennoscandian sheet, Beringia was a peculiar climatic sweet spot. The massive glaciers acted as moisture barriers, wringing the clouds dry before they could reach the land bridge. As a result, it remained an arid, chilly steppe tundra. It wasn't a sheet of white ice. It was a palette of browns and ochres, tough grasses, sagebrush, dwarf willows, and sedges. For the people trapped here, life was a cycle of extreme adaptation. They likely lived in small, highly mobile bands, following the seasonal migrations of the remaining megafauna. The woolly mammoth was still king here, but the diet was diversifying. We have evidence from sites on the Alaskan side of the bridge, like the Upward Sun River, that they were consuming salmon and freshwater fish. This is a crucial detail. It suggests that while they were people of the steppe, they were also retaining and perhaps refining the aquatic skills their ancestors had used on the Asian coast. During this long isolation, something profound was happening in their blood. Because the population was small, perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals, and completely cut off from the gene flow of Asia, the process of genetic drift took over. Unique genetic mutations occurred and were rapidly fixed in the population. The specific haplogroups, the genetic lineages found almost exclusively in indigenous peoples of the Americas, such as mitochondrial haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, were forged in this Beringian incubator. These people ceased to be East Asians. They became a distinct biological group, the Beringians, uniquely adapted to the high-latitude stress. We can reconstruct their world through the few archaeological whispers that survived on the higher ground that wasn't flooded. We find tiny, razor-sharp microblades, stone tools that were slotted into bone or antler handles to create composite weapons. These were lightweight, easily repairable, and deadly efficient, perfect for a mobile hunter who couldn't afford to lug heavy stones around. We find delicate-eyed needles, confirming that the tailoring technology of the steppe had been preserved and likely improved. A tear in a parka here wasn't just a wardrobe malfunction, it was a death sentence. The long polar nights of Beringia would have been a time of intense storytelling. With the sun refusing to rise for weeks in the dead of winter, the oral tradition became the library of the people. They would have passed down the knowledge of the before times, perhaps faint memories of the lands to the west, mixed with the practical encyclopedias of survival, which lichens were edible, how to predict a blizzard, and the migration routes of the caribou. This cultural continuity was the steel backbone that allowed them to endure thousands of years of limbo. But the earth is never static. Around 15,000 years ago, the great climatic wheel began to turn once more. The LGM broke. The sun grew slightly warmer, the orbital cycles shifted, and the ice sheets began to rot. For the Beringians, this was both a blessing and a crisis. The warming meant life would become easier in some ways. Game might become more plentiful, the summers longer, but it also meant that their home was disappearing. As the global ice melted, water poured back into the oceans. The sea levels began to rise, inch by creeping inch. The low-lying plains of central Beringia, the best hunting grounds, began to turn into marshes, then salt flats, and finally open ocean. The people were being squeezed. The rising water was pushing them toward the higher ground on the eastern edge of their world, toward what is now Alaska. At the same time, the barriers that had locked them in were starting to fail. To the east, the massive blockade of the North American ice sheets began to show cracks. For decades, the prevailing theory was that an ice-free corridor opened up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, a narrow, dry highway running down the center of Canada. The old textbook story was that the Beringians saw this corridor open and charged down it, hunting mammoths all the way to New Mexico. However, recent science has dismantled that story. Geological studies suggest that while the ice-free corridor did eventually open, it was likely biologically dead for centuries, a muddy, unlivable scar between two dying glaciers, offering no food or firewood. It wasn't a highway, it was a death trap. By the time it was truly passable, humans were already living in South America. So, if the inland door was closed, how did they get out? The answer lay to the south. The melting ice was affecting the coastlines first. The western edge of the North American ice sheet, where the glaciers met the Pacific Ocean, began to retreat. A fringe of land emerged, a chain of islands, fjords, and peninsulas that hugged the coast of modern-day Alaska and British Columbia. This was the escape hatch. The Beringians, who had been pushed to the edge of the rising sea, looked south and saw a route that didn't require fighting through the ice. They saw the Kelp Highway. The realization that the way forward was by water, not land, shifts our perspective of these people entirely. They weren't just mammoth hunters slogging through the mud. They were likely skilled mariners, perhaps using skin boats similar to modern kayaks or umiaks, frames of driftwood or bone covered in stitched walrus hide. These boats are light, tough, and capable of navigating icy waters. As the pressure of the rising Bering Sea mounted behind them, the vanguard of the Beringian population pushed off from the rocky shores of southern Alaska. They weren't looking for a new continent. They were looking for the next seal colony, the next kelp bed, the next safe harbor. They were entering a world of mist and cedar, of crashing waves and towering glaciers that calved directly into the sea. The isolation was over. The incubation period was finished. The genetic code of the Americas had been written, the tools had been sharpened, and the boats were ready. The thousands of years of stillness on the submerged subcontinent were about to give way to one of the fastest migrations in human history. The Beringians were launching themselves down the Pacific coast, riding the ecological richness of the kelp forests toward a future that would see them populating two vast continents from the Arctic Circle to the fires of Tierra del Fuego. For decades, the standard textbook illustration of the first Americans depicted a group of weary hunters clad in furs, trudging on foot through a narrow, windswept corridor between two towering walls of ice. They were shown clutching spears, their eyes fixed on the retreating haunches of a mammoth marching down the center of the continent from Alberta to Montana. It was a compelling image, heroic and stoic, but it was almost certainly wrong. The ice-free corridor was indeed a geological reality, but new radiocarbon dating and paleo-environmental studies suggest that by the time it was biologically viable, capable of supporting enough game to feed a migrating tribe, humans were already lighting fires in the southern hemisphere. The true path to the Americas was not a dry valley of dust and gravel. It was a wet, rolling green road that floated on the surface of the Pacific Ocean. We call it the Kelp Highway. This theory, which has revolutionized American archaeology, posits that the Barinians didn't walk to the New World. They paddled, and they didn't struggle against a starving landscape. They rode a conveyor belt of ecological abundance that stretched unbroken from the rim of Siberia all the way to Baja California. The logic of the Kelp Highway is rooted in biology. Giant kelp forests are among the most productive ecosystems on our planet. They form dense underwater jungles that harbor a specific and consistent menu of life: sea urchins, abalone, mussels, crabs, rockfish, and sea otters. Crucially, this ecosystem is linear and continuous. A mariner paddling a skin boat off the coast of Alaska would look down into the water and see the exact same food sources as they would see 3,000 miles south off the coast of California. This consistency was the magic key. It meant that the migrants didn't need to reinvent their survival toolkit every few hundred miles. They didn't need to learn which berries were poisonous in a new forest or how to track a strange new animal on the plains. They just needed to know how to harvest the kelp forest. A fishhook that worked in the Aleutian Islands worked perfectly in Oregon. A technique for prying abalone off a rock in British Columbia was just as effective in Mexico. This allowed for a migration speed that would have been impossible on land. They could skim down the coast, effectively surfing this single biological wave. The geography of this route was dramatic. To their left, the massive Cordilleran ice sheet loomed like a white fortress, its glaciers grinding down from the mountains and calving into the sea with thunderous crashes. To their right lay the endless gray expanse of the North Pacific. They navigated the slim, chaotic boundary between the two. But it wasn't a solid wall of ice. We now know that the coastline was dotted with refugia, ice-free pockets of land, islands and headlands that had escaped the glaciers. These refugia were the stepping stones. We can imagine the flotilla of skin boats, likely distinct from modern kayaks, perhaps broader, open-decked umiaks capable of carrying entire families, dogs and trade goods, pulling into a sheltered cove on a rocky island. The island might have been covered in scrub pine and grasses, a green oasis in a world of blue and white. Here, they would beach their craft, dry their gear, and harvest the rich shellfish beds exposed by the tide. They might stay for a season or perhaps just a few weeks before the curiosity or the current pulled them south again. The archaeological proof of this maritime diaspora is incredibly hard to find, for the same reason the southern coastal route out of Africa is obscure. The ocean ate the evidence. When the ice sheets eventually melted, global sea levels rose by roughly 400 feet. The ancient coastlines where these people camped are now miles offshore and deep underwater. However, recent discoveries on the edges of the continental shelf have given us glimpses. On Trique Island in British Columbia, archaeologists unearthed a hearth dating back 14,000 years, older than the opening of the inland ice corridor. They found fishhooks and tools made of obsidian, proving that these people were mariners capable of navigating open water to trade for volcanic glass. Further south, on the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California, we find the remains of the Arlington Springs Man, dating to around 13,000 years ago. The crucial detail here is that the Channel Islands were never connected to the mainland. To get there, you had to have a boat. This proves definitively that the earliest inhabitants of North America were comfortable on the water. They were not landlocked mammoth hunters who stumbled onto a beach. They were a culture of the coast. As they moved south, skirting the edge of the ice sheet, the climate began to soften. The biting winds of the Arctic gave way to the misty, rain-soaked temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. Giant cedars and firs began to appear on the slopes. The water teemed with salmon making their annual runs up the rivers, a resource so abundant it would eventually support the complex settled civilizations of the Haida and Tlingit people. But the first wave kept moving. The psychological experience of this journey must have been profound. These people were skirting the edge of a continent they could not yet fully enter. The ice sheet acted as a barrier, keeping them pinned to the shore. They were exploring the hem of the garment, unable to see the vast fabric of the continent that lay beyond the mountains. But the kelp highway provided everything they needed. It was a low-risk, high-reward route. There were no saber-toothed cats lurking in the kelp beds. Fresh water was available from glacial melt streams cascading into the ocean. It was a cold, wet, but relatively safe passage. Then, inevitably, they reached the end of the ice. Somewhere around the latitude of modern-day Washington State or Oregon, the great white wall of the Cordilleran Glacier finally receded. The coastline straightened out. The mountains, while still rugged, were no longer buried in ice. For the first time in thousands of miles, they could turn left. They could look inland and see river valleys opening up, green and inviting, leading into the heart of a new world. This was the off-ramp. While some groups undoubtedly stayed on the coast, continuing to follow the kelp highway all the way down to Baja and eventually the Andes, others turned their boats upstream. They paddled up the Columbia River, the Snake River, and the Sacramento. They moved from the salt water to the fresh, carrying their harpoons and their adaptability with them. Entering the interior of North America south of the ice sheets was like stepping into a different epoch. They found a land that had been separated from the rest of the world for millions of years. It was a landscape of giants. The Columbian mammoth, larger than its woolly cousin, grazed in the valleys. Giant ground sloths, the size of elephants, lumbered through the woodlands pulling down tree branches. Camels and horses, species that had actually evolved in the Americas before spreading to Asia, still roamed the plains here. The arrival of humans in this pristine landscape was an ecological shock. These animals had never seen a human. They had no instinct to run from the small two-legged figures. This naivety, combined with the lethal efficiency of the projectile technologies the humans brought with them, would set the stage for a rapid transformation of the American ecosystem. But before the inland conquest could fully begin, the coastal expansion continued its relentless momentum. The kelp highway didn't stop at the U.S. border. It continued south, past the deserts of Baja, changing in character but not in function. The waters remained rich. The wave of migration moved with a speed that is startling to consider. Evidence from the site of Monte Verde in southern Chile, nearly at the bottom of the world, dates to at least 14,500 years ago. This means that once the bottle was uncorked in Alaska, humans reached the southern tip of South America in just a few thousand years. They sprinted down the hem of the continents. The Pacific Coast Highway was the delivery system for the first Americans. It allowed them to bypass the frozen interior, to thrive on the edges of the hostile ice, and to deposit seed populations at the mouth of every major river system along the western edge of the Americas. As the skin boats bobbed in the gentle swells off the coast of California, the mariners could see the smoke of new fires rising from the hills. The long isolation of Beringia was a memory. The ice was behind them. Ahead lay two massive unmapped continents, teeming with life and waiting to be named. The seal hunters were about to become the masters of the plains, the jungles, and the high Andes. As the pioneers of the Pacific coast turned their boats upstream, paddling against the currents of the Columbia, the Sacramento, and the Colorado rivers, they were leaving the maritime world behind. They were stepping off the edge of the map and into a continent that was, for all intents and purposes, a different planet. The interior of North America, roughly 13,000 years ago, was a landscape of staggering biological richness, a place where the megafauna of the Ice Age still roamed in numbers that defy modern comprehension. The entry of humans into this pristine ecosystem marks one of the most explosive chapters in the history of our species. It was here that the Beringians transformed into the Clovis culture, and in doing so, they became the most efficient big game hunters the world had ever seen. The signature of this new era is a stone tool that is as beautiful as it is deadly, the Clovis Point. Named after the town in New Mexico where it was first identified in the 1930s, this spear tip is the technological equivalent of the suppression of the Neanderthals or the invention of the eyed needle. It is a masterpiece of flint knapping. A typical Clovis point is lance-shaped, often made from high-quality, colorful chert or jasper. But its defining feature is the flute, a shallow groove chipped out of the base on both sides. This flute allowed the point to be hafted or attached remarkably securely to a split wooden shaft. This wasn't just a rock on a stick, it was a piece of high-velocity engineering. When tipped onto a spear and launched with an atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever to increase force, a Clovis point could punch through the thick hide of a mammoth and penetrate deep into the vital organs. The stone was designed to break on impact in a specific way, causing massive internal trauma. It was a weapon designed for giants, and the sudden ubiquity of these points across North America, from Oregon to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Arizona, tells us that once this technology was invented, it went viral with lightning speed. The people wielding these weapons found themselves in a hunter's paradise. The North American continent was a zoo of monsters. In the open woodlands of the East and the spruce forests of the Midwest, they encountered the American mastodon. These were stockier and more muscular than mammoths, with flatter heads and teeth designed for crushing twigs and leaves rather than grinding grass. They were forest browsers, lurking in the shadows of the tree line. On the open plains, they found the Columbian mammoth, a beast that stood 13 feet tall at the shoulder, significantly larger than its woolly Siberian cousin, with spiraling tusks that could reach 16 feet in length. But the menu didn't stop there. There were camels, descendants of the species that had originated in North America millions of years earlier. There were horses, ancient relatives of the mustangs that would return with the Spanish long after these original herds went extinct. There were giant beavers the size of black bears living in the wetlands of the Midwest. And then there were the ground sloths. These were not the slow, tree-hugging creatures of modern South America. The giant ground sloth, Megalonyx, was an ox-sized tank of an animal that could rear up on its hind legs to strip the leaves off trees, armed with massive claws that could disembowel a predator. Even larger was the Aramotherium, found in the southern reaches, which weighed as much as a bull elephant. The meeting between humans and these animals was a collision of two worlds. The animals of North America had evolved in the absence of human predation. They knew how to fight a saber-toothed cat or run from a pack of dire wolves, but they had no evolutionary context for a hairless biped that could strike from a distance. They likely watched with curiosity rather than fear as the hunters approached. This naivety was fatal. The archaeological record at sites like Blackwater Draw in New Mexico shows the aftermath: mammoth skeletons with Clovis points embedded in their ribs, the smoking gun of a successful kill. The spread of the Clovis people across the continent was rapid, often described as a blitzkrieg. In a matter of a few centuries, they had reached the Atlantic seaboard. We find their campsites at the Galt site in Texas, where they stayed for long periods, manufacturing tools and processing game. We find their presence at the Topper site in South Carolina and the Shoup site in Pennsylvania. They were moving fast, likely driven by a combination of wanderlust and the need to find new hunting grounds as local game populations became wary or depleted. This rapid expansion brings us to the dark side of the story, the Quaternary extinction event. Within 1,000 years of human arrival, the vast majority of North America's megafauna vanished. The mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, and giant sloths were wiped off the face of the earth. For a long time, the overkill hypothesis argued that humans were solely responsible, that we literally ate our way through the continent. Today, the view is more nuanced. The climate was also changing violently as the Ice Age ended, stressing these animal populations, changing their habitats, and altering the vegetation they ate. But the timing is too coincidental to ignore. Humans were likely the final straw. We were the new apex predator that pushed a stressed ecosystem over the edge. We killed the breeding females, we burned the habitats to clear brush, and we outcompeted the other predators. The disappearance of the megafauna changed the landscape forever. The open mammoth steppe that had been maintained by the grazing of millions of giant beasts began to close up, turning into dense forests or modern prairies. As the megafauna died out, the Clovis culture fragmented. The uniform technology that had spanned the continent broke apart into distinct regional cultures. In the Great Plains, the Folsom culture emerged, developing smaller, finer points designed to hunt the swift ancient bison that had survived the extinction. In the forests of the East, other traditions took root, adapting to a life of deer hunting and nut gathering. The great uniform wave of the invasion was settling down into a mosaic of tribes and nations. But the migration didn't stop at the Rio Grande. The funnel of Mexico beckoned. The geography of Central America acts as a natural bottleneck, channeling movement south. As the descendants of the first waves pushed through the tropical forests of Panama, they were entering yet another new world. The Isthmus of Panama is the bridge to South America, and crossing it meant leaving the familiar biomes of the north behind and entering the neotropics. Here, the landscape became even more challenging. The dense rainforests of the Darien Gap and the Amazon basin required a completely different set of survival skills. The stone tips of the Clovis hunters were less useful in a jungle where the game was smaller and lived in the canopy. We see the toolkit change again. We see the emergence of fishtail points, a style distinct to South and Central America. The speed at which humans penetrated South America is perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire global migration. We know they reached Monteverde in southern Chile incredibly early, predating the Clovis culture in North America by at least a few centuries. This suggests that while the Clovis hunters were spreading out across the plains of the U.S., another group, the coastal express travelers we tracked earlier, had kept going, skirting the entire western coast of South America without stopping to colonize the interior. By the time the inland hunters of North America were taking down the last mastodons in Michigan, their distant cousins in the south were already adapting to life in the high Andes and the Amazon. Rock art in the Serranía de la Lindosa in the Colombian Amazon depicts a lost world of biodiversity. Giant sloths, horses, and what look like mastodons, painted by people who were living in the rainforest over 12,000 years ago. These paintings are a testament to the adaptability of the human mind. In the span of a few thousand years, the same genetic family had learned to survive on the Arctic tundra, the Great Plains, the temperate rainforests, and now the steaming equatorial jungle. The peopling of the Americas was the final exam for Homo sapiens. It tested every skill we had acquired since leaving Africa. It demanded that we be mariners, big game hunters, botanists, and architects. By the time the dust settled on the extinction of the megafauna, the two American continents were no longer empty. They were a patchwork of cultures, languages, and adaptations. The New World was fully inhabited. From the Arctic Circle to the edges of Patagonia, the fires were lit. But there was one final frontier left, one last finger of land pointing toward the Antarctic, a place of wind and storm that represents the absolute end of the habitable Earth. The journey that had begun in the rift valleys of Ethiopia 60,000 years ago was approaching its geographic terminus. The momentum of the migration was pushing humanity toward the end of the world, Tierra del Fuego. As the human wave washed down the spine of South America, the geography of the continent began to conspire against them. In the north, the land is vast and wide, holding the sprawling green lungs of the Amazon and the towering peaks of the northern Andes. But as you travel south, the continent begins to taper. It narrows, squeezing the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans until it becomes a slender, jagged finger, pointing accusingly at the bottom of the world. The migrants moving down this corridor were entering Patagonia, a region of wind-scoured steppes, basalt plateaus, and glacial lakes that mirrors the harshness of the Siberian tundra they had left thousands of years and thousands of miles behind. The journey into Patagonia was a reversal of the tropical adaptation. The people who had learned to hunt monkeys in the canopy of Colombia and fish for piranha in the Amazon basin now had to remember the old ways of the North. They were walking back into the cold, but they were doing so with a toolkit that had been refined by millennia of travel. At sites like Fell's Cave in southern Chile, archaeologists have uncovered the fishtail points, beautifully crafted stone weapons that are the South American answer to the Clovis point. These distinct flared base points were used to hunt the last of the southern megafauna, the Mylodon, a giant ground sloth, and the Hippedion, an ancient American horse. The arrival in this region, roughly 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, represents the final geographic sprint. The archaeological evidence here is stark and undeniable. In the volcanic caves of the Pali Aiki field, we find the hearths of these first Patagonians. They were burning guanaco bones and retreating from the ferocious westerly winds that scream across the pampas. This wind is a defining feature of the landscape. It bends the trees into permanent twisted bows and chills the bone even in summer. Surviving here meant mastering the microclimate again, finding shelter in the lee of cliffs and wearing the thick, warm hides of the guanaco, a wild relative of the llama. But the land didn't just narrow, it shattered. At the very tip of the continent lies the Strait of Magellan, a treacherous, churning waterway that separates the mainland from the archipelago of Tierra del Fuego. When the first humans arrived, the sea levels were still lower than today, and it is likely that Tierra del Fuego was connected to the mainland by a tenuous bridge of land or ice, or separated by channels narrow enough to be easily crossed by the skin boats of the Pacific Coast mariners. They crossed over, and in doing so, they stepped onto the true end of the world. Tierra del Fuego is a rugged mountainous island roughly the size of Ireland, covered in dense southern beech forests and capped with glaciers. To the south lies nothing but the Drake Passage, the roughest stretch of ocean on the planet, and then the frozen silence of Antarctica. There was no more south to go to. The migration that had begun in the Rift Valley of Africa, that had crossed the Red Sea, skirted the Indian Ocean, braved the Siberian steppe, and traversed the Americas, had finally run out of land. The people who settled here, the ancestors of the Selknam, Ona, and Yaghan, Yamana peoples, developed one of the most resilient and fascinating cultures in human history. They were the ultimate extremophiles. The Yaghan, in particular, became the nomads of the southern sea. They lived their entire lives on the water, navigating the icy fjords in bark canoes. Their adaptation to the cold was biological as well as technological. Early European explorers, including Charles Darwin, who visited the region on the Beagle in the 1830s, were shocked to see the Yaghan people paddling in sleet and snow while wearing almost nothing, often just a sealskin draped over the windward shoulder or completely naked. Darwin famously described them as stunted and miserable, failing to understand that he was looking at a marvel of human physiology. The Yaghan had evolved a metabolic rate significantly higher than the average human. Their bodies were furnaces. They smeared themselves in animal grease to insulate their skin against the water and wind. But their most ingenious adaptation was their relationship with fire. They didn't just build fires at campsites, they carried fire with them. In the center of their bark canoes, they built a hearth on a bed of clay and sand. The fire traveled with the family, providing warmth, cooking food, and signaling their location to others. When Ferdinand Magellan sailed through the strait that bears his name in 1520, he looked out at the dark, foreboding coastline and saw hundreds of these fires flickering in the night, fires on the beaches, fires in the forests, and fires floating on the water itself. He named the land Tierra del Humo, land of smoke, but the King of Spain later renamed it Tierra del Fuego, land of fire, deciding that where there is smoke, there must be fire. It is a poetic name that inadvertently honors the technological mastery of the people who conquered the cold. Life at the end of the world was reliant on the bounty of the sea. The cold currents that swirl around Cape Horn are nutrient-rich, supporting massive colonies of fur seals, sea lions, and whales. For the canoe people, a single stranded whale was a windfall that could support a clan for months. They hunted seals with harpoons, displaying a level of maritime skill that rivaled their distant ancestors who had crossed to Australia. But here, a capsize meant death in minutes due to hypothermia. The margin for error was zero. On the main island, the Selknam people took a different path. They were the foot hunters of the interior, stalking the guanaco herds with bows and arrows. They were tall, robust, and powerful, physically distinct from the canoe people. They wrapped their feet in guanaco skin to protect against the snow and built conical huts of timber and hide. Their spiritual life was rich and complex, centered on the Hoin ceremony, a rite of passage for young men that involved elaborate body painting and masks to impersonate the spirits of the forest. These haunting images, captured in photographs in the early 20th century before their tragic genocide, show figures that look like modern abstract art, striped, dotted, and masked, standing against the bleak backdrop of the Fuegian winter. The settlement of Tierra del Fuego completes the global arc. It is the final punctuation mark in the sentence of human expansion. When a Yagan hunter stood on the cliffs of Cape Horn, looking south at the churning gray waves of the Southern Ocean, he was standing at the terminus of the habitable earth. Behind him lay a continuous chain of human habitation stretching back across the Andes, up the spine of the Americas, across the submerged bridge of Beringia, through the vastness of Asia and back to the dusty cradle of Africa. The distance is almost impossible to comprehend. The walking distance from the Omo Valley in Ethiopia to Tierra del Fuego is roughly 20,000 miles, not counting the detours, the backtrackings, and the wandering. It took our species roughly 50,000 years to walk it. In that time, we changed from dark-skinned tropical foragers to pale-skinned mammoth hunters to seafaring islanders, and finally to the grease-smeared canoe nomads of the Antarctic Gateway. There's a profound silence at this end of the world. The wind drowns out everything else. But in that silence, there is a triumph. The fact that human beings could make a home here, in a place where the sleet travels sideways and the sun barely climbs above the horizon in winter, is the ultimate proof of our species' most defining trait. We are not specialists. We are not designed for the jungle, or the savanna, or the ice. We are designed to change. We are the water that takes the shape of the cup. By 10,000 years ago, the conquest was effectively over. The flags had been planted. From the ice sheets of Greenland, which were being probed by the Sakak culture, to the fires of Tierra del Fuego, from the deserts of Australia to the caves of France, Homo sapiens had gone everywhere. The great empty spaces on the map had been filled. The Great Migration was no longer a movement, it was a state of being. We had become a global species. The fires of Tierra del Fuego were not just keeping the cold at bay, they were a signal to the universe that the naked ape had finished its walk. We had run out of horizon, but the journey wasn't just about covering distance. It was about what we became along the way. As the last group settled into the bays of the Beagle Channel, the first chapter of human history, the chapter of expansion, closed. The next chapter, the chapter of density, agriculture, and civilization, was about to begin. But before we turn that page, we must take a moment to look back at the trail we blazed, to see the whole staggering picture of how we won the world. If you were to view the Earth from the vantage point of the moon, speeding up the film of the last 60,000 years to play in the span of a single minute, you would witness a biological phenomenon unlike anything else in the history of life. For the first few seconds, the flickering lights of human campfires would be confined to the African continent, a faint pulsing glow in the rift valleys and along the southern coasts. Then, suddenly, a spark would jump the gap of the Red Sea. From that moment, the spread would be relentless. You would see the light creep along the rim of the Indian Ocean like a slow-burning fuse. It would flare up in the jungles of Southeast Asia, jump the invisible waterlines to Australia, and burst into a brilliant radiance across the frozen plains of Europe. You would see it pause, seemingly stuck, at the gateway to the Americas, before suddenly pouring down the western spine of the New World like a river of lava, splitting and filling every valley and basin until the light stopped only at the crushing ice of the Antarctic. In the blink of a geological eye, a single species of African primate went from being an endangered refugee in a volcanic winter to the tenant of every habitable room in the global mansion. This is the Great Migration. It is the defining event of our existence. It explains everything about who we are, why we look the way we do, and how we treat the world around us. We are the children of this journey, and the dust of the road is still on our shoes. Reflecting on this odyssey, we must confront the sheer improbability of it all. There was no guarantee that Homo sapiens would survive the Toba bottleneck. There was no destiny that said we had to cross the Wallace Line or figure out how to sew a parka to survive the Siberian cold. Every single step of this journey was a gamble. It was a series of choices made by individuals, fathers looking for food, mothers looking for safety, explorers looking for the horizon, that cumulatively resulted in the conquest of the planet. We have seen that we are not a pure species. We are a mosaic. As we moved, we absorbed. We carry the genes of the Neanderthals who helped us survive the European winter and the Denisovans who helped us breathe the thin air of the Himalayas. We are the sum of all the hominids who came before us, the last survivor of a crowded family tree. The loneliness we sometimes feel as a species, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the desire to find others, perhaps stems from the fact that for most of our history we weren't alone. We shared this planet with other minds, other versions of humanity. Now, we are the only ones left to remember them. This journey also solved the paradox we started with, the illusion of race. We began this story by noting that humans are genetically almost identical, yet visually diverse. The migration explains this. The differences in our skin tone, our eye shape, our hair texture, and our height are not deep biological divisions. They are simply the calling cards of the climates we passed through. Dark skin was the armor of the equator. Pale skin was the vitamin sponge of the sunless north. Squinting eyes were the snow goggles of the steppe. Tall, thin frames were the radiators of the savanna. These are recent, surface-level adaptations, the biological equivalent of changing your clothes to suit the weather. Underneath the hood, we are all still the same band of survivors who huddled in the caves of Pinnacle Point. But the conquest of the planet came at a cost. We must acknowledge that we were not always benevolent guests. The arrival of humans almost always coincided with the silence of the giants. The megafauna, the woolly mammoths, the diprotodons, the giant sloths, vanished as we advanced. We were an invasive species, the ultimate disruptor. We changed the ecology of every continent we touched, burning forests to create grasslands and hunting apex predators to extinction. The world we live in today is a garden that we weeded and pruned to suit our needs, long before we planted the first seed of wheat or corn. And what happened when we ran out of world? This is perhaps the most profound implication of the migration. For 50,000 years, the solution to every problem, social conflict, lack of food, disease, was to move. There was always a next valley. There was always an empty frontier. But when the fires of Tierra del Fuego were lit, and the last islands of the Pacific were colonized, the safety valve closed. We had filled the container. This saturation is what likely forced the next great revolution, agriculture. When you can no longer move to find new food, you have to make the land you are standing on produce more. The end of the migration was the beginning of civilization. We traded the campfire for the hearth, the tent for the house, and the freedom of the trail for the security of the village. We stopped expanding outward and started growing upward, building cities, hierarchies, and empires. Yet, the migratory instinct has never truly left us. It is a ghost in our machine. You see it in the restless energy of the modern world, in our obsession with travel, in the way we look at the stars. We are not designed to sit still. The neophilia, the love of the new, that drove a bamboo raft across the Timor Sea, is the same impulse that drove a tin can to the moon. We are currently in a pause, a planetary standstill, similar to the one in Beringia. We are gathering our resources, sharpening our tools, and looking at the next ocean, the black ocean of space, waiting for the moment to push off from the shore again. As we bring this bedtime story to a close, let your mind drift back over the map we have drawn. See the green Sahara, the drowned continent of Sundaland, the white silence of the Mammoth Steppe, and the kelp forests of the Pacific. Imagine the millions of footsteps, the births, the deaths, the storms, and the sunrises that make up this chain of events. You are the result of the greatest success story in the history of life. Your ancestors were the ones who didn't freeze, who didn't drown, who didn't starve, and who didn't give up. They were the master adapters, the ones who learned to eat everything, live everywhere, and turn the very stones and bones of the earth into tools of survival. The fire is dying down now. The embers are glowing a soft, deep red. The story of how we got here is finished, but the story of where we are going is just beginning. We are the planet wanderers, the world shapers. We are the species that walked out of Africa and didn't stop until we had touched the face of the entire world. And now, roughly 60,000 years later, we can finally rest, knowing that there is no mountain we haven't climbed and no horizon we haven't chased. The map is full, the night is quiet, and the world, all of it, is yours.